At 11:42 p.m., Arav Malhotra's phone sent its final signal. It didn't call for help. It didn't dial emergency services. It didn't even send a message. It simply existed, briefly, on a cell tower grid near Dockyard Corridor 7. Then it went silent. If you've ever driven through an industrial stretch after midnight, you know the feeling. The way the city thins out. The way streetlights grow farther apart. The way sound changes. Engines echo longer. Footsteps feel amplified. It's not fear exactly. It's exposure. Arav drove into that corridor at 11:39 p.m. He never drove out. Stay with this reconstruction. Because what happened inside that 3-minute window wasn't chaos. It was execution. Arav was 19. Mechanical engineering student. State, level 400-meter sprinter. Structured, disciplined, predictable in the best way. His days followed routine 6 a.m. track drills. Classes. Gym. Study group routine shake. Sleep. On the night he vanished, nothing broke pattern. Security footage captured him leaving the university track complex at 10:58 p.m. He was alone. Gym bags slung over one shoulder. Earbuds in. Sweat darkened T-shirt clinging to his frame. He waved to the night guard. He looked tired but normal at 11:07 p.m. He texted his roommate, "On my way. Don't finish the shake." At 11:12 p.m., toll booth cameras captured his silver hatchback entering the highway ramp. At 11:39 p.m., traffic cam 4B showed his car turning into Dockyard Corridor 7. At 11:41 p.m., camera 4B glitched. At 11:42 p.m., his phone pinged the nearby tower. At 11:43 p.m., the device was remotely factory reset. 3 minutes. Detective Rachel Monroe arrived at the overpass 2 days later, 6:50 in the morning. Dawn light flattened the industrial skyline into cold geometry. Her boots scraped against broken glass as she stepped beneath the overpass arch where Arav's car had been found. Locked. No broken windows. No shattered headlights. No panic scratches on the door handles. The dashcam had been cleanly removed. Inside the vehicle, it looked staged. Not tossed. Not fought over. Just emptied of disturbance. Forensics found a faint diluted smear of blood on the rear seat fabric. The quantity was small. Too small to confirm injury severity. It could represent a nosebleed. It could represent something else entirely. There were no visible drag marks outside the vehicle at first glance. No shell casings. No shattered phone fragments. But Monroe didn't start with the car. She started with the road. Because vehicles are containers. Predators work outside containers first. She crouched low, running gloved fingers along the asphalt beneath the overpass beam. The surface texture changed near the shadow line. A faint arc, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. A rubber scuff. Measured width suggested a second vehicle had stopped parallel to Arav's driver's side. Close. Too close for comfort. Roland reconstructed the timing back at the task unit. 3 minutes between camera glitch and phone reset. That's not random violence. That's coordination. The glitch logs revealed manual interference. Not a system-wide outage. Someone accessed the junction box physically and disrupted feed 4B alone. Which means someone knew exactly which camera covered that corridor. Someone who had walked it before. Monroe requested maintenance logs for the industrial surveillance grid. Meanwhile, something else surfaced. 10 years earlier, 3 young men disappeared within a 2-kilometer radius of Dockyard Corridor 7. Different year months. Same time window. Between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. each case categorized as insufficient evidence. Each vehicle recovered. Each interior cleaned. No bodies ever found. The files had gathered dust. But patterns don't disappear. They wait. Back at the overpass, Monroe stood in the exact position where Arav's car had been discovered. She visualized the geometry. His vehicle pulled slightly right. A second vehicle blocking driver exit. Approach from blind side. Open door. Injection? Blunt force? Threat with weapon? There were no defensive wounds reported, because there was no body to examine, which leaves one unsettling possibility. He may have been conscious when he left that vehicle. Monroe walked 2.8 meters from the driver's side position toward the support column. There, a faint scrape against concrete. Linear. Measured. Not from a bumper, from something being moved. Controlled. She didn't announce it to the team. Not yet. Predators who erase leave behind subtraction, not addition. No noise complaints were filed that night. No emergency calls. No residents reported screams. The corridor absorbed sound. Warehouses on both sides, steel walls, open concrete spans. If someone had forced Arav into another vehicle, it would have taken less than 20 seconds. Door open, compression, silence. The phone reset suggests remote access. That requires planning, a burner relay perhaps, or physical possession of the device, which means the phone was likely taken immediately. Inside Arav's financial records, a detail emerged. 3 days before disappearing, he withdrew 7,000 rupees in cash. No unusual purchases recorded after. The 3 older cold cases showed similar withdrawals before disappearance. Small amounts. Not ransom level. Not debt level. Meeting level. Was he meeting someone voluntarily? Or was someone testing compliance? Monroe doesn't believe in coincidence clusters. She believes in rehearsal. Dockyard Corridor 7 wasn't random geography. It was infrastructure. Limited lighting. Minimal foot traffic. Industrial access roads allowing quick exit to freight routes. And critically, multiple blind spots in surveillance coverage if you knew where to stand. By midday, telecom triangulation identified a prepaid number active within 500 meters of the corridor during Arav's disappearance window. The same prepaid number signature had appeared near the 3 prior cold case disappearances. Activated briefly. Deactivated permanently within hours. Different CM cards, same behavioral pattern. That's not anger, that's method. Back at the unit, Roland placed the 4 case files side by side. Rohit Sinha, Danish Kapoor, Vikram Jadhav, Arav Malhotra, all athletic, all capable of resisting. All vanished without recorded struggle. If you are strong enough to fight, and you don't fight, then something prevented it. Chemical restraint, authority impersonation, trust. Monroe replayed Arav's campus footage again. Freeze frame at 10:58 p.m. He glances over his shoulder before entering the parking lot. Not fear. Recognition. The footage resolution wasn't high enough to capture who he might have been looking at, but that glance lasted 1.4 seconds. Longer than casual. Shorter than alarmed. Familiar enough not to panic. Dockyard Corridor 7 wasn't just a trap. It may have been a destination. And if that's true, then Arav didn't drive into darkness by accident. He drove toward someone. The question isn't just who took him. The question is, how many times had this corridor erased someone before anyone decided to notice? Monroe closed the cold files gently. Predators adapt, and someone had just resumed a pattern that had been waiting 10 years. This wasn't a disappearance. It was a system restarting. Archived cases don't demand attention. They erode into silence. Rohit Sinha, 2016. Danish Kapoor, 2017. Vikram Jadhav, 2019. All disappeared within a 2-kilometer radius of Dockyard Corridor 7. No bodies, no suspects, no sustained media pressure. Each case had followed the same trajectory. Early urgency, expanding search perimeter, volunteer sweeps, social media appeals, then gradual quiet. Families left suspended. Files left shelved. Monroe reopened each one. Rohit's vehicle had been found facing westbound beneath an unused freight ramp. Interior wiped with an ammonia-based cleaning agent. Trace fibers collected but never matched. No blood. Danish's car was discovered near an abandoned way station. His backpack remained in the passenger seat. Wallet untouched. Phone missing. Vikram's SUV had been parked near a shuttered warehouse loading dock. Rear floor mat damp, later determined to be diluted bleach. 3 vehicles. 3 clean interiors. Now Arav. 4 points on a map. Roland pinned their recovery locations across the digital board. When the markers connected, they formed a loose triangular perimeter. Arav's car sat nearly central to the geometry. Monroe stared at the layout for a long time. Predators hunt in comfort zones. They establish radius. They refine routes. They memorize blind spots. She requested satellite overlays spanning the years of disappearance. Infrastructure changes were minimal. A few lighting upgrades. 1 warehouse demolition. Traffic camera installations expanded, but not uniformly. Dockyard Corridor 7 remained structurally consistent. A controlled environment. The telecom team delivered deeper data on the prepaid number detected during Arav's disappearance. The device had been activated at 11:31 p.m., deactivated at 12:58 a.m. No outgoing calls recorded. But that didn't mean inactivity. Short-range Bluetooth interference had been detected near camera junction 4B during the glitch window. Someone may have used a localized signal disruptor, not advanced military-grade equipment. Commercially obtainable, That changes the profile. This wasn't impulsive violence. This was someone investing in process. Financial analysis across all 4 victims revealed another alignment. Each withdrew between 5,000 and 8,000 rupees within 72 hours before vanishing. Not enough to indicate extortion. Not enough to trigger banking alerts. But enough to suggest meeting-level cash. Monroe Cross referenced the victim's recent contacts. No direct overlap. Different friend groups. Different campuses. Different neighborhoods. Which means the connector wasn't social. It was situational. What did they share? Late night training routines. Predictable schedules. Physical capability. Confidence. If someone intended to subdue a physically fit young man without visible struggle, the method had to be fast. Chemical incapacitation would explain absence of defensive signs. Monroe ordered toxicology soil sampling from beneath the overpass. Meanwhile, a new detail emerged from Vikram Jadav's archived case. A security guard from a neighboring warehouse had once reported hearing a van engine idling near mid on the night Vikram disappeared. The tip had been logged. Never followed. The guard described it as white or light, colored. Common enough to ignore. Now it mattered. Traffic analysis from Airav's night showed a white delivery van entering Corridor 7 at 11:36 p.m. It exited at 11:44 p.m. The license plate was partially obscured by dirt. Enhanced imaging isolated 3 digits. Insufficient for full match, but sufficient to narrow model type. Monroe requested municipal delivery company logs. She also requested private warehouse access records for the corridor radius. Warehouse 12C stood out. Officially inactive for 8 years. Owned by a holding corporation registered to a legal intermediary. Utilities marked inactive. Yet satellite heat signatures over the last 3 months showed intermittent thermal spikes between midnight and 3 a.m. Someone was inside. Not continuously. Periodically. Controlled occupancy. The warrant process began quietly. Because if this was rehearsal, they could not afford to alert the performer. Back at the overpass, forensic sweep teams re-examined the support columns. Under angled light, faint parallel scrape marks appeared on the concrete surface approximately 2.8 meters from where Airav's driver door would have opened. Not random abrasion. Linear. Measured. As if something weighted had been placed down briefly. Roland reviewed the timeline again. 11:39 p.m. Airav enters corridor. 11:41 p.m. Camera glitch begins. 11:42 p.m. Phone ping. 11:43 p.m. Device reset. 11:44 p.m. White van exits corridor. 5 minutes. If the van was involved, that means containment, transfer, and digital neutralization occurred within 3 minutes of camera disruption. That requires rehearsal. It also requires proximity. Monroe considered a possibility most investigators resist early. The offender may not be selecting victims randomly. He may be interacting with them prior, testing vulnerability, establishing trust. The 7,000 rupee withdrawals bothered her. Were the victims paying for something? Or contributing toward something? Gym memberships, equipment purchases, private training sessions. Roland expanded the search into athletic communities. 3 of the 4 victims had recently joined independent late-night training groups advertised through informal messaging channels. Unregistered. Word of mouth. Cash contributions required. The group names were different across years, but the contact number listed in archived screenshots shared a pattern in formatting with the prepaid number detected near Corridor 7. Disposable. Rotating. Temporary. Monroe leaned back in her chair. This wasn't rage. This wasn't spontaneous abduction. This was recruitment. Dockyard Corridor 7 may not have been the hunting ground. It may have been the rendezvous. If that's true, then each victim drove there willingly. Which means each victim believed they were meeting someone they trusted. The search warrant for Warehouse Well 20C was signed at 20:14 a.m. The raid would begin at 300. Because if someone had turned disappearance into routine, then tonight might not be rehearsal. It might be scheduled. At 2:58 a.m., the corridor was empty. At 3:02 a.m., the breach team moved. Warehouse 12C did not look occupied. Corrugated metal siding worn by salt air, rust climbing the seams. The loading dock half collapsed on one side. No exterior lights. No vehicles parked nearby. Inactive on paper. Dormant in utility records. But heat signatures don't lie. Monroe stood to the rear of the stack formation. Denim collar turned up against the wind cutting through the docklands. She didn't rush operations. She preferred clean entries. The side access door gave way under hydraulic pressure in less than 10 seconds. Inside, the air was still. Not abandoned, still. Contained, still. Dust had settled evenly across the main floor, except for one path, subtle but visible under angled light, leading toward the far right quadrant of the warehouse. Someone had been walking the same route repeatedly. The interior was largely empty. No stacked crates. No machinery. No visible workspace. Just concrete floor and steel beams disappearing upward into shadow. But in the far corner stood a secondary structure built within the warehouse shell. Reinforced drywall. Clean edges. Newer than everything around it. Soundproofing foam lining the exterior seam. No visible windows. One metal door. Unlocked. Monroe nodded once. The door opened inward. Plastic sheeting lined the interior walls from floor to ceiling. Not loose. Secured tightly with industrial fasteners. A drainage channel cut along the concrete floor, sloping toward a sealed floor grate. The room measured approximately 4 by 5 meters. Large enough to contain. Small enough to control. No visible blood. No tools left in open sight. But the absence was deliberate. Forensics entered. Luminol was sprayed. The room reacted. Faint blue blooms spread across the concrete in controlled patches. Not chaotic spatter. Linear staining. Repeated cleaning cycles. Roland observed quietly as the forensic team mapped the reaction zones. Rectangular impressions became visible, consistent with the weight distribution of a heavy metal table positioned centrally. Anchoring points were found embedded into the floor, removed recently. Screw heads still warm under thermal scan. Someone had dismantled equipment within the last 48 hours. Monroe moved to the far wall. There were scratch marks at shoulder height. Not frantic gouges. Measured abrasions, as if wrists had been secured against resistance. On the opposite wall, near the door, 3 shallow indents aligned vertically. Impact points. Head level. Repeated. Controlled. No blood pooling, which suggests meticulous cleanup. Inside a steel drawer unit pushed against the rear wall, investigators found sealed packages. 4 prepaid mobile starter kits. Identical brand. Identical batch sequence. 1 missing. Roland didn't speak immediately. He studied the geometry of the room. This was not improvisation. This was infrastructure. Ventilation had been modified. A concealed duct system routed airflow upward through the warehouse ceiling. Odor mitigation. Electrical wiring had been installed independent of the main warehouse grid. Portable generator mount found outside along rear exterior wall. No digital surveillance equipment left behind. No fingerprints. Glove use likely. Monroe crouched near the drainage channel. Residual trace indicated diluted chlorine compound. Multiple applications. The floor grate led to a removable waste container. Empty, which means disposal occurred off-site. The question shifted. This was not a holding cell. This was a process room. The victims were likely brought here after transfer from the corridor. But why this location? Warehouse Weller 20C sat almost exactly central within the triangular recovery pattern of the 4 vehicles, a logistical midpoint. If the offender operated alone, this was efficient. If he operated with assistance, it was controlled. Outside, dawn light began bleeding into the horizon. Inside, the room remained artificially cold. Thermal readings showed recent cooling. Industrial-grade portable AC unit found in adjacent chamber. Cooling slows decomposition. Cooling reduces odor. Cooling preserves time. Time for what? Monroe stood and visualized sequence. Arrival. Containment. Restraint. Procedure. Removal. But there were no cutting instruments found. No bone fragments. No tissue remnants, which suggests either exceptional sanitation or that the procedure was not dismemberment. Roland received a call from Digital Forensics mid-scene. The prepaid number detected near Arav's disappearance had briefly connected to a secondary device 36 minutes before activation. That secondary device pinged near Warehouse Well 12C, and nowhere else. It had been powered on for less than 4 minutes, then powered off permanently. The IMEI trace was scrubbed, which requires technical literacy beyond casual use. Monroe walked back through the warehouse floor, following the faint dust path toward the entry. The path width matched standard shoe size, men's approximately 9 or 10. Uniform stride length. No hesitation. No pacing patterns. This wasn't a chaotic offender. This was someone calm inside control. Near the rear exit, Faint tire impressions were visible in residual dirt along the loading dock. Forensic casting indicated mid-sized cargo van tires. Recent, matching approximate width of the white van seen leaving Corridor 7. Still no license confirmation, but the circle tightened. Back inside the sealed room, one detail shifted the psychological profile. On the interior door handle, barely visible, was a faint indentation shaped like repeated finger placement. Not random grip. Habitual positioning. Someone had opened and closed this door many times, comfortably. Monroe turned to Roland. "This isn't escalation," she said quietly. "It's continuation. 10 years between Vikram's disappearance and Arav's. A gap. Dormancy. Or incarceration." Background checks began across former industrial workers, warehouse leaseholders, delivery contractors, and security personnel active during the first cluster years. One name surfaced repeatedly across archived access logs. Arvind Mehta, former maintenance contractor for Dockyard Infrastructure from 2014 to 2018, assigned to surveillance grid calibration. Familiar with camera blind spots. Terminated after internal audit flagged irregular overtime claims. No criminal record. Currently listed as independent transport operator. Owner of a white commercial cargo van registered 6 months prior. Partial license digits matched 2 of the 3 enhanced characters from the traffic cam. Still circumstantial. Still incomplete. But pattern recognition does not ignore convergence. Monroe ordered discreet surveillance on Mehta. No arrest yet. No public alert. Because if Mehta was involved, and if this was rehearsal refined over years, then the mistake would not come from panic. It would come from routine. Warehouse Weldry C did not contain bodies, but it contained something more useful. Evidence of repetition. And repetition is what exposes systems. Arav was not an isolated event. He was the 4th data point. Which means, if the pattern held, there may be another scheduled point already approaching. Arvind Mehta did not look like a predator. He looked like a systems man. 38 years old. Former dockyard maintenance contractor. Technical certification in electrical grid calibration. 6 years assigned to surveillance upkeep across industrial corridors, including Dockyard Corridor 7. He knew where cameras overlapped. More importantly, he knew where they didn't. His employment file showed nothing violent. No complaints from coworkers. No prior arrests. Terminated in 2018 after discrepancies in logged maintenance hours. The audit described him as technically proficient, socially reserved, resistant to oversight. Since then, he operated as a freelance transport contractor, white cargo van, mid-sized. Commercial registration renewed 6 months ago. Partial plate digits matched 2 of the 3 enhanced from the 11:44 p.m. and exit footage. Not confirmation, but convergence. Monroe authorized discreet surveillance. No knock, no contact, not yet. Because if Mehta was responsible, confrontation without leverage would end in disappearance. Again, surveillance began at 6:40 p.m. Mehta's apartment was located in a quiet residential block 15 kilometers from the dockyard, 3rd floor. No visible security cameras installed outside his unit. Curtains drawn consistently. He exited at 7:12 p.m. alone. Neutral posture. Unhurried. Dressed in plain workwear. No visible agitation. He entered the white cargo van. The van's rear windows were tinted darker than regulation permits. Minor violation. Not arrest. Worthy. He drove. Not toward Dockyard Corridor 7. Toward the northern Frederick route. Monroe followed via secondary unit. Mehta stopped at a 24-hour fuel station. Paid cash. No interaction beyond transaction. Then he drove to an open industrial yard and parked for 42 minutes. Engine off. Lights off. No observable activity, testing surveillance, or simply waiting. At 8:38 p.m., he returned home. Routine. Unremarkable. Too unremarkable. Roland reviewed historical transport logs connected to Mehta's freelance contracts. Several short, distance, private cargo. Jobs listed without corporate clients. Cash payments noted. No invoice trail. Dates of those contracts aligned within weeks of Rohit, Danish, and Vikram's disappearances years earlier. The pattern deepened. Monroe requested judicial approval for GPS placement on the van, granted under probable cause citing correlation to active missing persons case. Installation occurred overnight. No detection. The following evening at 10:11 p.m., the GPS ping activated. The van moved. Direction and southbound, toward Dockyard Corridor 7. Monroe's voice remained steady over comms. Maintain distance. No lights. The van entered the corridor at 10:34 p.m. and under earlier than Arav's timeline. He parked beneath the same overpass beam where Arav's car had been found. Engine idled. 5 minutes passed. 10. At 10:47 p.m., another vehicle entered the corridor. A motorcycle, rider male, helmeted. The motorcycle slowed near the van, stopped. No visible struggle. The rider dismounted, approached the passenger side. Door opened, closed. Motorcycle remained standing. At 10:50 p.m., the van drove off. Motorcycle left behind. Engine cold within minutes. The rider had not re-emerged. Monroe did not hesitate. Intercept. The units moved. The van had taken the freight bypass road. Speed steady. Not accelerating. No panic driving. At 10:57 p.m., 2 patrol units boxed the van near a signal junction. Lights activated. Siren short burst. The van pulled over immediately. Compliance. Monroe approached driver's side. Mehta rolled the window down, calmly. Yes, his tone neutral. No visible tremor in his hands. Step out of the vehicle. He complied. No resistance. Rear doors opened under police instruction. Interior empty. No rider. No equipment. No visible blood. Cargo space contained plastic crates and folded tarpaulin sheets. Nothing illegal in plain view. Monroe's gaze did not shift. Where did the motorcycle rider go? Amada blinked once. What rider? His pulse measured normal. No spike detected by portable biometric scan. Body language controlled. Surveillance footage replayed on mobile unit. Clear visual of rider entering passenger side. Mehta watched the clip. Expression unchanged. That's not my van, he said evenly. Plate confirmed. GPS confirmed. The denial was not frantic. It was procedural. The motorcycle recovered beneath the overpass belonged to Kunal Arora, age 20, gym enthusiast, reported missing by his sister at 11:15 p.m. Monroe's jaw tightened. The timeline was accelerating. Search of the van interior under warrant revealed something subtle. A faint chemical odor embedded in the cargo fabric. Not bleach. Something sweeter. Air samples were collected. Back at the warehouse, forensic teams intensified examination of ventilation ducts. Inside one duct seam, a trace fragment was discovered. Fibrous, organic, human epithelial tissue. DNA results rushed. Meanwhile, Kunal Arora's phone last pinged at 10:46 p.m. Dockyard Corridor 7. Reset at 10:49 p.m. Pattern intact. Mehta remained detained for questioning. No formal charge yet. His residence was searched under emergency extension warrant. Inside, the apartment was minimal. Clean, organized. No trophies. No visible contraband. In a locked drawer beneath his workbench, officers found something small. 4 identical gym membership cards. Different names. Expired. Rohit Sinha, Danish Kapoor, Vikram Jadhav, Arav Malhotra. Monroe did not react outwardly. Inside her head, the geometry completed. This was recruitment. Mehta had embedded himself in late-night athletic circuits over years. Temporary training groups, cash contributions. Trust built. He chose men who believed strength equaled safety. He arranged private late-night sessions near the dockyard. The corridor was rendezvous. The warehouse was process. The van was transfer. The phones were neutralized within minutes. And the bodies, still unaccounted for. DNA from the duct fragment returned at 3:12 a.m. match Rohit Sinha, which means warehouse Waluc had not been abandoned for a decade. It had been operational during the first disappearance cluster, and Mehta had resumed activity recently. Kunal Arora was still unaccounted for, but his timeline was current, which meant if intervention had occurred fast enough, he might still be alive. Monroe leaned across the interrogation table. Where is he? Mehta held her gaze. Silence can be a weapon. But so can time, and time for once was not entirely on his side. Kunal Arora had been missing for 43 minutes. That is not a long time in most cases. In this one, it was everything. The van was empty. The warehouse was already under seal, which meant if Mehta had transferred Kunal, he had done so before interception. Monroe replayed the corridor footage again. 7:47 p.m. Motorcycle arrives. 10:48 p.m. Rider approaches passenger side. 10:49 p.m. Passenger door closes. 10:50 p.m. Van departs. But something new surfaced under frame by frame enhancement. The van's rear suspension dipped slightly at 10:09:12. Weight shift, not toward the back, toward the front. Passenger side. If Kunal had entered willingly, why would the weight distribution register so abruptly? Roland zoomed further. There, at 10:49:09, A subtle arm movement from inside the van before the rider reached the door. Door opened from within, not from outside, which means Meta anticipated arrival, not chance encounter. Pre-arranged meeting. But that still didn't explain disappearance inside the van within minutes. Forensic air analysis from the cargo compartment returned results at 1:08 a.m. Trace presence of sevoflurane derivative. An inhalational anesthetic. Rapid onset. Fast sedation. Requires medical familiarity to dose correctly. Too much, fatal. Too little, ineffective, which means Meta either studied pharmacology or had assistance. Monroe redirected search teams, not toward the warehouse, toward transport nodes, bridges, water access points, freight loading docks. Because if bodies were not found in Warehouse 12C, they were being moved elsewhere. GPS logs from the van showed a brief signal interruption between 10:51 and 10:54 p.m., 3 minutes. Not random. That stretch of road passed beneath an old railway undercut with concrete tunnel walls. Signal blackout zone. Monroe pulled satellite imagery. The undercut ran adjacent to a drainage canal feeding into the eastern shipping basin. Limited access. Minimal patrol coverage at night. Search teams deployed immediately. Meanwhile, Meta remained composed in interrogation. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly. "Am I?" Monroe replied. "You're seeing patterns because you want to." "No," she answered. "I'm seeing them because you built them." He smiled faintly. Predators who rely on control often miscalculate when that control fractures. At 20:17 a.m., search divers entered the drainage canal near the undercut. Visibility was low. Industrial runoff, silt heavy. 47 minutes later, a diver surfaced, found something. Weighted tarp. Industrial rope, submerged at shallow depth, secured to rebar protruding from canal wall. The tarp was cut open carefully on shore. Inside, Connell Aurora, unconscious, pulse present, respiration shallow but stable, no visible trauma beyond mild injection mark along left trapezius. Rapid transport to trauma unit. Estimated sedation time under 1 hour. Intervention window narrow, but successful. Monroe did not show relief. Relief compromises focus. If Kunal survived, he could break the system. Back at interrogation, Monroe placed a photograph on the table. The tarp. The rope. The canal. "You miscalculated the patrol rotation," she said quietly. Meta's gaze flickered once. "First deviation." Or, he replied calmly, "You interrupted a transfer." Transfer. Choice of word noted, which means he did not consider the canal final disposal. Which means the canal was staging. Which means there was another location. Conal regained consciousness at 5:42 a.m., disoriented. Nauseated. Fragmented recall. He remembered arriving at the corridor. He remembered opening the passenger door. He remembered a smell. Sweet. Then pressure at his neck. Then nothing. He had not felt threatened. He had believed he was meeting a private performance coach, referred through an invite, only athletic forum, cash-based sessions, strength optimization, no online traceable payment. The contact number matched the prepaid sequence found in Warehouse 12C. Recruitment confirmed. Monroe asked him one question. "Did you meet him before?" Kunal nodded weakly. "Twice." "Aware. Warehouse. Different one. Different warehouse. Not 12C, which means Weller 12C was not the only site, which means the triangle on the board was incomplete. Roland re-examined old cases for overlooked site mentions. Rohit had once told a friend he was training near the docks. Danish mentioned a private conditioning session in a text thread 3 days before vanishing. Vikram had withdrawn cash citing specialized coaching. The predator's method wasn't abduction. It was mentorship. He selected ambitious young men seeking competitive edge, offered exclusive improvement, built dependency, scheduled late-night sessions to avoid witnesses. Dockyard Corridor 7 was neutral ground. Transfer occurred only when trust matured, which means there were likely others. Unreported. Monroe obtained full digital recovery from Meta's seized laptop. Encrypted partition discovered. Brute force initiated. Inside the apartment's ceiling cavity, officers found something more telling: a ledger. Handwritten. Dates. Initials. Amounts. 4 names circled. RSDKVJAM. Next line below. KA. Phase 2. Phase 2. Which means what occurred inside Warehouse 12C was Phase 1. And Phase 2 required relocation. The encryption cracked at 8:12 a.m. Inside the hidden partition were satellite maps with marked coordinates along the eastern shipping basin. 4 red markers, 1 green. The green marker time-stamped tonight. Monroe studied the coordinates. They led beyond the canal, beyond municipal patrol zones, to an abandoned cold storage freight container yard scheduled for demolition in 2 weeks. If bodies had been preserved, cooling would explain the absence of decomposition evidence in 12C. Cooling would preserve time. Time for transport. Time for ritual. Time for something not yet fully understood. Monroe stood, prepare warrants for the yard. Amata watched her through the interrogation glass. Still controlled. But now, time was no longer his tool. It was hers. And somewhere inside a refrigerated container, history might be waiting. At 9:14 a.m., the demolition yard gates were forced open. The abandoned cold storage container facility sat 3 kilometers east of the canal, tucked behind rusted fencing and stacks of decommissioned freight units. Officially inactive. Unofficially forgotten. Perfect for preservation. Monroe stepped onto gravel layered with frost residue leaking from malfunctioning refrigeration units. The air felt wrong, colder than the morning warranted. 27 containers remained on site, most tagged for scrap. 5 still connected to auxiliary generator lines. 1 generator was running. Fresh fuel smell lingered. Roland didn't speak. He simply looked at Monroe. Green marker. Timestamp tonight. They moved toward the active unit. The padlock had been recently replaced. Bolt cutters snapped it in under 10 seconds. When the doors opened, condensation rolled outward like breath. Interior temperature 4 degrees Celsius. Industrial cooling. Preservation range. Inside the container were not bodies laid openly. They were organized. Metal racks installed along both sides. Large industrial-grade storage bins sealed and labeled only with numeric codes. Monroe approached the nearest bin. Lid opened slowly. Inside, vacuum, sealed bags, human remains, segmented, cleanly processed, no chaotic cuts, precise separations at joint articulations. Professional. Roland exhaled once, no emotion, just confirmation. 4 bins were filled, 1 bin empty, tag number corresponding to tonight's date, which means Kunal had been intercepted between Phase 1 and Phase 2. The canal tarp had been temporary containment. The container was final staging. Monroe ordered forensic documentation before further disturbance. DNA sampling confirmed within hours. Rohit Sinha, Danish Kapoor, Vikram Jadhav, Arav Malhotra. The system had been operating across a decade. Preservation explained the absence of remains in landfill searches. No burial sites. No random dumping. Everything centralized, controlled. A ritual of order. Inside the container office annex, investigators found additional materials. Medical texts. Anatomical diagrams. Precision cutting tools sterilized and labeled. A portable surgical lamp disassembled into a travel case. Meta had no formal medical degree, but the execution quality suggested training, formal or obsessive self-study. On a metal clipboard clipped to the wall was a checklist. Phase 1. Recruitment Phase 2. Conditioning Phase 3. Harvest Phase 4. Storage. The word, harvest, was underlined. Monroe read it twice. This was not rage. This was systematized dehumanization. The victims were not people inside his structure. They were components. Roland reviewed financial traces again. No large unexplained deposits. No organ trafficking transactions. No dark web payments. Which means this wasn't profit-driven. The preservation bins contained no extraction packaging for sale. Organs were removed, yes, but not cataloged for distribution. Instead, separate, smaller insulated containers were found within the annex freezer unit. Inside, preserved muscle tissue samples, labeled by date. Not for resale, for study. Kunal's testimony replayed in Monroe's head. Performance coach. Athletic recruitment. Target selection. Physically optimized young men. Healthy tissue. Strong cardiovascular baseline. The ledger recovered from Meta's apartment contained biometric notes beside each victim's initials. Body fat percentage. VO2 max estimates. Strength metrics. He wasn't selecting randomly. He was curating. Why preserve muscle tissue? Why maintain cooling long-term? The answer came from digital forensics at 12:37 p.m. Encrypted folder within Meta's drive contained video files. Not distribution content. Not trophies. Self-recorded documentation. Meta speaking into camera clinically. Explaining methodology. Describing physiological adaptation experiments. He believed, falsely, that transplanting micro segments of muscle into his own body would accelerate performance evolution. Autologous enhancement theory twisted beyond science. He had been performing unsanctioned graft attempts on himself. Scars along his abdomen and thigh noted during custody medical scan now made sense. He believed he could engineer superiority. Monroe closed the laptop. This wasn't about killing. It was about upgrading. The victims were raw material. The cold storage was inventory. Phase 3, harvest. Phase 4, storage. There was no Phase 5 listed, which suggests continuation was indefinite. Meta had not escalated frequency recently by coincidence. He had refined efficiency. The gap between 2019 and 2026 may not have been dormancy. It may have been recovery from self-inflicted surgical complications. Medical records showed Meta hospitalized in 2021 for severe infection of unknown origin. Untreated graft rejection would explain hiatus. He resumed once stabilized. Monroe returned to interrogation. She did not raise her voice. She placed the checklist on the table. He looked at it, then at her. "You preserved them," she said. Silence. "You believed you were improving." A faint tightening at the edge of his jaw. Not anger, not shame, recognition. "You don't understand adaptation," he replied quietly. "No," Monroe said evenly. "But I understand murder." He leaned back. "They volunteered," he said. "Volunteered for conditioning," she corrected. "Not dismemberment." He did not argue, because he did not perceive contradiction. In his framework, the outcome was evolution. The victims were data. Kunal's survival disrupted the sequence, which meant Phase 2 had been incomplete, which meant evidence existed of procedural deviation. Forensics confirmed injection compound residues inside warehouse 12C. Sedative cocktail precisely calibrated. Monroe returned to the container yard once more before sunset. The doors remained open, cold air dissipating. 4 lives reduced to numbered bins. 10 years of calculated absence. Dockyard Corridor 7 had not erased them. It had redirected them. The pattern was complete now. Recruitment, transfer, sedation, harvest, storage, and continuation. But one detail lingered. The green marker on the satellite map had not been the only recent addition. There was a faint, faded yellow marker dated 3 weeks prior. No corresponding bin inside the container. No name in the ledger. Monroe stared at it. Patterns rarely end cleanly. If the yellow marker represented a test run, or an aborted cycle, then someone else may have entered the corridor and survived without reporting, which means the system's shadow might extend further than confirmed victims. Meta would be charged, convicted, contained, but containment does not erase methodology. Someone else could study it, replicate it. The corridor would still exist. The blind spots would remain. Monroe stepped away from the container as forensic teams sealed evidence. For the first time since Arav's signal disappeared, there were answers. But answers are not closure, they are structure. And structure reveals how easily absence can be engineered. Dockyard Corridor 7 did not create a predator. It provided architecture, and architecture, once understood, can always be rebuilt. The system was exposed, but systems leave residue beyond their architect. Kunal Aurora became the variable Meta had not accounted for. He survived Phase 1, which meant he carried fragments of Phase 2. 48 hours after recovery, Kunal was stable enough for extended cognitive interview. Monroe did not rush him. Memory under sedation returns in layers. Too much pressure fractures recall. Too little loses detail. The room was quiet. No bright lights. No intimidation. Just sequence reconstruction. "You met him twice before the corridor," Monroe began. Kunal nodded slowly. "Warehouse," he said. "Different one. Smaller. Location. Near docks, but not as deep. I remember cranes. Smell of diesel. That narrowed grid radius." Monroe laid out satellite imagery across the table. Kunal's finger hovered, then pressed. "Container repair depot north of the basin. Inactive for 3 years. Not on Meta's primary property trail, which meant secondary site, the one used for conditioning. Phase 2. What happened there?" Monroe asked. "He trained me," Kunal said. "How?" "Strength drills. Isometric holds." He measured everything. Heart rate. Grip force. Recovery time. Any injections. Kunal hesitated. After second session. Said it was a recovery enhancer. Burned a little. Monroe kept her tone even. Weir. Back of my shoulder. Injection mark consistent with sedative entry point later used during transfer. Phase 2 was not just conditioning, it was tolerance testing, building physiological profile, determining dosage accuracy. That means Rohit, Danish, Vikram, and Arav all underwent conditioning before disappearance, which means there were sessions prior to Phase 3 that left traces. Attendance logs, CCTV glimpses, fuel station stops, witness memory. The container repair depot was raided at 3:18 p.m. Inside, the layout mirrored warehouse Wellswell sees structural discipline, but smaller scale. No plastic sheeting, no drainage, just a training space, metal racks, free weights, resistance bands, portable biometric scanner equipment, wall-mounted whiteboard. On it, initials, metrics, dates DK, VJAM, KA, and below them 2 additional sets of initials. STMR. No bins in cold storage had matched those, which meant either aborted cycles or future targets. Monroe Cross referenced missing persons database. No matches, which means ST and MR were alive. Potential Phase 1 recruits. Financial data sweep located 2 recent cash withdrawals tied to those initials through gym membership cross matching, both scheduled for private late-night sessions within the coming week. The system was still active, not through Meta alone, because Meta had been in custody during the past 48 hours, which means there was an accomplice. Roland replayed interrogation footage at minute 17:42 of initial questioning when Monroe referenced transfer interruption. Meta had corrected terminology. You interrupted a transfer, not my transfer. No possessive pronoun. Subtle, but deliberate. Phone analysis from Meta's seized devices revealed limited outbound communication. However, the encrypted partition contained shared folder synchronization logs. External device access 3 weeks prior. Unidentified hardware signature, which means someone else had access to operational data. Monroe returned to cold storage yard. Re-examined tool layout. 2 sets of glove sizes present. One larger, one slightly smaller. Surgical precision across tissue segmentation consistent, but some incision angles varied by a few degrees between earlier and later bins. Different hands. Same method. The accomplice was not improvising. They were learning. Warehouse Well 20C had been primary harvest site. Container Depot North Basin had been conditioning site. Cold storage yard was preservation site. 3 nodes. 1 architect. 1 apprentice. Which means Meta may not have viewed himself as sole executor. He may have believed in succession. Kunal's voice broke the analysis. He said evolution doesn't stop with one body. He recalled quietly. Monroe looked at him. Did he mention anyone else? Kunal swallowed. He said someone understood. That single phrase reframed everything. Understanding implies ideological alignment, not coercion. Roland scanned Meta's employment history again. During dockyard maintenance tenure, he had supervised 2 junior contractors for camera grid calibration. One name resurfaced. Sanjay Thakur. Initials ST. Recently employed as refrigeration technician. Access to cooling systems. Access to container yards. No criminal record. Current address located within 5 kilometers of the conditioning depot. The second name, Manav Rao. Initials MR. Independent welder. Occasional contract work at freight depots. Access to metal fabrication. Access to container modifications. The apprentice model crystallized, Meta-built framework. Thakur maintained preservation systems. Rao modified structures. Division of labor. Monroe authorized simultaneous pickup warrants. If either man detected Meta's arrest through media leak, they could dismantle evidence. Units moved fast. Thakur was detained at refrigeration service call site without incident. Rao attempted to leave his residence with travel bag. Intercepted 2 blocks from bus terminal. Inside Rao's bag, portable hard drive, surgical gloves, cash. Both men denied involvement. Both claimed contract only professional interaction with Meta. But forensic swabs from conditioning depot returned mixed DNA profiles. One matched Thakur. The second matched Rao. Cold storage container tool handles contained the same mixture. 3-person system. Architect, technician, fabricator. Monroe placed all 3 in adjacent interrogation rooms. Isolation fractures collective narratives. Thakur broke first. Not with confession. With rationalization. We weren't killing, he said defensively. He was advancing. Advancing what? Human durability. The ideology was shared. They believed controlled tissue transfer could enhance resilience. They documented results meticulously, each harvest recorded as trial iteration. Rao admitted structural construction of warehouse WLC in a room, payment in cash, no digital trail. They did not perceive themselves as criminals. They perceived themselves as pioneers, which made them more dangerous. Because pioneers justify collateral, Kunal became the fracture point in their system. Living testimony, surviving variable, phase 2 incomplete, which means procedural gaps now existed in their documentation. Gaps prosecutors could exploit. As night fell again over Dockyard Corridor 7, police presence increased. Camera blind spots patched. Maintenance logs updated. Surveillance grid recalibrated. But Monroe stood beneath the overpass once more. The architecture hadn't changed. Just the awareness. 3 men had engineered disappearance through discipline, through trust, through recruitment masked as mentorship. They didn't snatch, they invited. They didn't rage, they refined. And refinement is harder to detect than violence. Roland reviewed the board. 5 confirmed victims, 1 survivor, 2 intended targets prevented, 3 offenders in custody, system dismantled. But Monroe's gaze lingered on the corridor's dark stretch beyond the last streetlight. Patterns end on paper, but belief systems don't. Somewhere, someone else could study their documentation, adapt, modify, rebuild. The corridor did not create predators. It revealed how environment can become instrument, and instruments. In the wrong hands. Do not stay silent forever. By the time formal charges were filed, the narrative was already forming outside the courtroom. Serial killer, organ trafficker, cult. None of those labels fit cleanly, because this case was not fueled by chaos. It was fueled by structure. 3 men stood charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, criminal conspiracy, unlawful human experimentation, and evidence destruction. Arvind Medha, architect. Sanjay Thakur, preservation technician. Manav Rao, structural fabricator. The prosecution's strategy was precise, not emotional, structural. They would dismantle the system the same way it had been built. Phase by phase. Recruitment, conditioning, harvest, storage. Kunal Arora became the central pillar of the case, the only surviving variable, the only living witness to the recruitment pattern. His testimony did not describe violence. That made it more unsettling. He described discipline, metrics, optimization language. He described admiration, and that, the prosecution emphasized, was the weapon. Trust was the entry point. Medha's recorded self-documentation videos were admitted into evidence after legal challenge. In them, he spoke calmly into camera, explaining muscle fiber density, explaining performance transfer hypothesis, explaining how genetic strength can be redistributed. No anger, no visible thrill, just certainty. The defense attempted to frame the acts as delusional disorder, psychological impairment. But forensic psychiatry evaluation determined Medha understood the nature and illegality of his actions. He concealed evidence. He encrypted files. He rotated prepaid devices. He adapted to surveillance upgrades. Those are not the behaviors of someone disconnected from consequence. Thacker's defense leaned toward coercion, claiming Medha dominated operations, yet financial records showed consistent profit-sharing patterns. Rao's defense claimed limited knowledge of final outcomes, but DNA evidence tied him directly to harvest, site tool handling. The trial lasted 8 weeks. Cold storage photographs were displayed in controlled sequence. The courtroom air changed each time a preservation bin appeared on screen. Families of Rohit, Danish, Vikram, and Arav sat in the second row daily. They did not look at the defendants. They looked at the evidence, because evidence ends uncertainty. Monroe testified on procedural reconstruction. She did not dramatize. She did not speculate. She laid out geometry. Dockyard Corridor 7 as rendezvous. Warehouse WLC as harvest site. Container depot as conditioning space. Cold storage yard as preservation hub. The prosecutor summarized it simply. This was not a moment of madness. It was a decade-long architecture of disappearance. Medha never interrupted. He took notes during testimony. That unsettled jurors more than outbursts would have. When asked directly during sentencing phase whether he felt remorse, he responded, "Regret is emotional." This was developmental. No further elaboration. The verdict unanimous. Guilty on all major counts. life imprisonment without parole eligibility. Thacker and Rao received equivalent sentencing under conspiracy statutes. The system was dismantled legally, but legal dismantling does not erase operational footprints. In the weeks following conviction, digital forensic teams continued combing through encrypted archives. They found something unexpected: a draft document titled Continuity Protocol. It outlined preservation techniques, infrastructure mapping, recruitment screening criteria, and a final section labeled Dissemination. There was no evidence the document had been shared, no upload logs, no outgoing encrypted transfers detected, but the file existed, which means Meta had considered legacy. Monroe reviewed it alone in her office late one evening. Not for horror, for vulnerability mapping. The document detailed blind spots in surveillance infrastructure that still existed in neighboring districts. It analyzed emergency response lag times. It recommended rural adaptation sites. Even in incarceration, the architecture could instruct. The department moved quickly. All physical and digital materials were sealed under court order. Access restricted. Academic publication requests denied. Containment extended beyond prison walls. Dockyard Corridor 7 remained under increased patrol for months. Then patrol normalized. Lighting upgrades were completed. Camera grid recalibrated with redundancy layers. Warehouse 20C was demolished. The cold storage yard cleared and repurposed. Physical architecture erased. But memory architecture persists. Conal resumed physical therapy. He returned to university under protective anonymity. He did not speak publicly. He did not accept media interviews. His survival was not spectacle, it was interruption. Monroe visited the overpass once more before the case formally closed. Late night. No cameras flashing, no tape, just empty road. She stood exactly where Arav's car had rested. 3 minutes had allowed a system to function. 3 minutes had nearly allowed it again. Predators who build systems rely on invisibility within routine. They exploit ambition. They mirror mentorship. They camouflage violence inside structure. This case did not end because of instinct. It ended because pattern was recognized before repetition stabilized. Roland finalized the file summary. 5 confirmed victims. 1 surviving witness. 3 convicted offenders. 0 unidentified remains. System dismantled before expansion. But his final line in the report did not describe closure. It described interruption. Because the belief that human potential can be engineered through violation does not disappear with one conviction. It waits. Adapts. Searches for architecture. Dockyard Corridor 7 will not appear in headlines again. It will simply remain a stretch of road beneath sodium light, ordinary, unremarkable, until someone studies absence the way Meta did, until someone mistakes ambition for consent, until someone builds a system and believes discipline makes it righteous. Cases like this do not end with spectacle. They end with awareness. And awareness is the only variable predators cannot fully control. The corridor is quiet now. But quiet is not safety. It is opportunity. And opportunity depends on who is watching. Cases close on paper. They do not always close in data. 3 months after sentencing, Roland reopened the digital archive, not because of new evidence, but because something unsettled him. The continuity protocol file had been seized and sealed, but its metadata showed an anomaly. Creation date aligned with Meta's authorship timeline. Modification date, however, extended 2 days beyond his arrest. 2 days. That means the file had been accessed, or altered, after Meta was already in custody. Initial assumption forensic duplication artifact, but hash comparison showed legitimate structural modification, not corruption, not auto, save residue. Someone had opened it. Inside a sealed evidence environment. Chain of custody logs were reviewed immediately. No breach recorded. No unauthorized access flagged, which left one possibility. The file had been synchronized before seizure, not uploaded externally, but mirrored locally. Roland reconstructed Meta's encrypted partition network history again. Hidden within routine system logs was a low-frequency Bluetooth pairing record from 3 weeks before arrest. Device name mask, MAC address partially scrambled, but signal strength indicated proximity inside Warehouse 12C. Someone had stood inside that room with an external device active. The apprentice model had already been confirmed. Thacker, Rao, both in custody, both isolated, both under monitored communication. Neither had accessed external systems post-arrest, which means the fourth presence inside Warehouse 12C had not been arrested. Monroe read the data twice, then once more. Someone learned, she said quietly. Recruitment, conditioning, harvest, storage. But dissemination was the missing phase. If Meta believed in evolution, he would not rely on single-point failure. He would teach, roll and cross, reference gym networks again. A pattern emerged. Across 5 districts, small late-night elite conditioning groups had begun advertising privately over encrypted messaging forums. No common branding, no shared contact numbers. But language patterns matched Meta's phrasing almost exactly. Performance elevation, genetic optimization, adaptive durability. Linguistic fingerprint analysis confirmed 83% structural similarity, not coincidence, copying, or continuation. Monroe ordered quiet infiltration, undercover athletic recruit, no arrest moves, no public alert, because premature visibility drives networks underground. The first session occurred in a rented industrial unit 15 kilometers west of Dockyard Corridor 7. Different architecture, same tone. The instructor was not Meta, not Thacker, not Rao, a younger man. Confident, charismatic, no visible surgical infrastructure. Just conditioning drills. Metrics recorded. Cash accepted. Phase 1. Monroe watched through remote feed. The instructor did not mention harvest, did not mention transfer, which means either he had not progressed beyond recruitment, or he was rebuilding slowly. Post-session, undercover operative was invited to private performance testing at a later date. Location undisclosed. Cash requested. The system was replicating. Not identical, but derivative. Meta had not disseminated the continuity protocol externally. But ideology spreads without files. Thacker had broken during interrogation. He had spoken about understanding. Who else had attended conditioning sessions over the years? Recruitment logs from conditioning depot showed more initials than confirmed victims. Several names had attended 1 or 2 sessions before discontinuing. One of those names matched the instructor's. He had once been Phase 1 candidate. He had withdrawn before Phase 2, and instead of becoming inventory, he became student. Monroe studied his background. Mechanical engineering dropout. Brief internship at Dockyard Maintenance during Meta's tenure. Exposure to surveillance systems. Access to blind spot knowledge. The architecture was never just physical. It was conceptual. And concepts migrate. The decision was strategic. Allow recruitment to continue long enough to expose full structure, then dismantle. Because arresting one instructor would not erase network seeds. Undercover infiltration deepened. Private testing session scheduled for 11:30 p.m. Location sent via prepaid number, not Dockyard Corridor 7, a different industrial strip, less known, fewer cameras. They had learned from the first collapse. Adaptation confirmed. Monroe stood outside the operations van as night fell. The sodium glow over the new corridor looked eerily familiar. Different geography, same design. Architecture repeats because it works. The instructor arrived in a dark SUV, not a white van. Different vehicle choice. Reduced pattern similarity. He greeted the undercover operative warmly. Trust building language. Performance metrics. Improvement promises. No visible sedation attempt. Not yet. He was cautious. Meta's arrest had accelerated evolution. Phase 1 extended. Phase 2 delayed, which made the new network more dangerous. Slower. Harder to detect. Monroe made the call. Move. The units intercepted before any isolation attempt. The instructor attempted to flee on foot. Apprehended within 30 meters. Inside his vehicle, no surgical tools, no refrigeration maps, just biometric scanners, encrypted laptop, and inside that laptop, draft document. Title, Adaptive Framework V2. Not identical to Meta's protocol, but structurally similar. Recruitment emphasis extended. Harvest logistics minimized. He had learned the vulnerability. Harvest drew attention. Recruitment did not. He planned to build a larger Phase 1 pool before advancing further, which means interruption occurred before escalation. Again, during interrogation, he did not deny influence. He was right about potential, he said calmly. But he rushed it. No remorse. Just revision. Monroe leaned back. You studied him? I improved him. Belief systems are iterative. They version control themselves. The court would process this case separately. But the pattern was undeniable. Dockyard Corridor 7 had been first architecture. The ideology had outgrown geography. Roland finalized the supplemental file. Original system dismantled. Derivative system interrupted during early replication. No additional victims. Recruitment cell neutralized. But his final observation in the addendum was simple. When violence disguises itself as mentorship, it spreads faster than force. The corridor is no longer the threat. The blueprint is. And blueprints do not need the same road twice. The second network collapsed before it matured. No harvest site established. No preservation infrastructure completed. No confirmed victims beyond recruitment stage. Interruption had worked. But interruption is not eradication. 6 months after the derivative arrest, Dockyard Corridor 7 returned to statistical normalcy. Traffic flows stabilized. Camera uptime reached 99.8%. No late-night anomalies detected. On paper, the case was closed twice. In reality, Monroe knew something different. The weakness had never been the corridor. It had never even been meta. It was the convergence of ambition and invisibility. Young men chasing improvement. Late-night isolation normalized. Cash transactions unrecorded. Industrial zones ignored. The predators exploited structure that already existed. They did not create darkness. They selected it. Roland completed the final cold case reclassification report. Rohit Sinha, Danish Kapoor, Vikram Gav, Arav Malhotra, official cause homicide, organized criminal conspiracy, Kunal Arora surviving victim, attempted expansion cell neutralized, addendum status closed with monitoring advisory. But one final audit remained, the seized continuity protocol and adaptive framework V2. Documents were subjected to full linguistic and conceptual analysis by behavioral specialists. Their conclusion was precise. The ideology was not inherently complex. It borrowed language from fitness culture, from optimization theory, from self-improvement rhetoric. It reframed harm as enhancement. That is what allowed it to spread quietly. It did not recruit through fear. It recruited through aspiration. Monroe presented findings to regional law enforcement leadership. The recommendation was not patrol increase, not task force expansion. It was awareness training within athletic institutions, universities, private gyms, independent coaching networks. If recruitment language reappeared, early reporting would collapse Phase 1 before Phase 2 could form. Prevention through pattern recognition. Dockyard Corridor 7 remained under reduced but consistent digital audit. But Monroe no longer saw it as epicenter. It was a lesson site, a proof of concept. Late one night, she returned there one final time. No press, no units, no flashing lights, just sodium glow and long concrete shadows. The overpass beam where Arav's car had rested looked smaller now. Ordinary, almost forgettable. That is the danger of architecture. It hides in plain sight. 3 minutes once allowed a system to function. 3 minutes nearly allowed it again in a different corridor. 3 minutes is not long enough for panic, but it is long enough for trust. And trust, once exploited, becomes a weapon sharper than force. Monroe replayed the sequence in her head one last time. Recruitment masked as mentorship. Conditioning masked as coaching. Sedation masked as recovery. Harvest masked as evolution. Storage masked as preservation. Each phase disguised inside language people already accepted. The corridor did not erase them. Language did. Ambition did. Isolation did. The case file would eventually move to archives. New investigations would take priority. New corridors would demand attention. But this one left something permanent behind. An adjustment in how absence is evaluated. If a physically capable young person disappears without resistance, consider sedation. Consider trust. Consider structured recruitment. Do not assume runaway. Do not assume accident. Do not assume coincidence. Because predators who build systems do not leave chaos. They leave subtraction. And subtraction is quieter than violence. Roland filed the final report at 23:59 hours. Timestamp deliberate. Closure marked at the edge of a day, not at its beginning. Because cases like this do not end cleanly. They taper. They dissolve into vigilance. Kunal graduated the following year. He did not return to competitive athletics. He shifted to biomechanics research, understanding performance without violating it. Interruption became transformation. Dockyard Corridor 7 stands unchanged. Street lights still flicker. Freight trucks still pass. Concrete still absorbs sound. Most drivers will never know what architecture once operated there. They will see only road, only shadow, only routine. And that is how it should remain, because the true safeguard is not barricades. It is recognition. Recognition that ambition can be weaponized. Recognition that mentorship can be mimicked. Recognition that systems can hide inside structure. The corridor is quiet, not because danger vanished, but because someone was watching closely enough to see the pattern before it stabilized. And sometimes, watching is the only architecture that keeps the next 3 minutes from becoming another disappearance.